So this is the start of chapter 20, which is sustainability, economics, and equity. So there is lots of legislation in this chapter, and so we'll kind of go over that. But NAFTA, basically in this opening, is to increase trade between U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And that's great for Canada and the U.S., but what it's led to, because Mexico is a developing country, is poor working conditions. So there's lots of cheap labor, and so they have these factories called maquiladora, and they basically have really poor conditions. And so just read about what kind of conditions there are, but not good. And it's great for, like I said, our economy. Lots of cheap goods and stuff like that come from Mexico, but not good for the people of Mexico. And so that's not NAFTA's fault, but NAFTA was just to kind of increase the trade between those three countries, but kind of led to because of the poor working conditions, poor living conditions, poor everything for Mexico, basically. All right, so Module 65 goes on to sustainability and economics. So they've deemed the basic necessities for people being food, water, shelter, education, and healthy, disease-free. So those are kind of the base necessities for people, and that's kind of what this chapter is based on, and these legislations and laws and acts are in place to protect people and give them these basic necessities. So well-being equals happy, healthy, and prosperous. And then when we look at economics, a lot of this chapter is going to be familiar to those of you that are seniors because you've gone through economics. And so that'll tie in really nicely, especially for the AP test. But economics is how humans allocate scarce resources. So we've got just a few resources, whether that's natural, whether it's resources that are pulled out of the ground, whether that is commodities, whatever it is. But it has to do with our resources that we have. All right, so moving on to page 724. This figure talks about supply and demand. So this is definitely something that you're talking about in econ. But we've got supply and demand, and basically as price goes up, supply is going to go up because people are going to buy less. So demand goes down, supply goes up. So what they want is an equilibrium. And so that's what the arrow is pointing at there in the center. And so that would be kind of a balance between the demand and the supply. And so that's kind of where price is set, and the quantity that maybe a business or producer would have on hand. So that's what's meant by that. And so this doesn't take into account any externalities, which we did talk about a few chapters ago. Externalities are the true cost that a good has. So that takes into account what type of resources were used to make that product. Which this doesn't. This just is supply, demand, very simple. So if we look at the supply for goods, those are affected by a few things. So if we look at how much goods are on hand, those are affected by input prices. How much does it take to manufacture the product? Technology, expectations on money. So is it worth a lot? Is it not worth a lot? What are people willing to pay for that product? And then the number of people selling. So if there's only a few people selling, that might drive the price up. If there's lots of people selling the product, then that might drive the price down. And then we put a value on things. So the value of a product is, the value of a product is set through its price. So meaning that, think about when you go to the store. If you see something that's really, really cheap, you kind of maybe question, well, what is the value of this? Is this really worth that price, or is this just going to fall apart? Or if something is extremely expensive. So a lot of times people think, okay, well, if something's really expensive, it must have a lot of value. It must be a really good product. That's not necessarily the case. But it's definitely set through its price. So that kind of makes you think, what is the value of this? And that has to do with how many goods are on hand, how many sellers there are, how much money people have to purchase. It depends a lot on that. And then if we look at the factors that affect demand, we've got income. So how much do the people make, and what they can afford. Prices of the related goods. So if you've got a product that's extremely expensive and everything around it is very cheap, like generic versus brand name, and it's essentially the same thing, you can't tell the difference. What are you going to spend on? Some people, the brand is important, but other people, the integrity or the how the product works is more important. And then taste. So is it attractive product? Is it something that's in style? Expectations. So is it expected to last a very long time? Sometimes people will be willing to pay more if it's going to last longer. And then how many people are buying it? So is there a lot of people buying it? Is there not a lot of people buying it? Sometimes when people start to buy things, it tends to make people that aren't buying it want to buy it because it's deemed as a value or a good product. So then going up to here, figure 65.2, this bullet note or this sticky note has to do with it. So I'll kind of zoom out. But the true cost of production would include these externalities. And so I showed you a video. It was the story of stuff on you can find it on YouTube, or just Google the story of stuff. But it went over the externalities of a product. So it talked about the lady bought a radio at Radio Shack. And so the radio was extremely cheap. So, the cost of making that radio wasn't really in the cost that she was paying. Think about when you went to when you go to the dollar store, for example. Does it really cost $1? It has to be made. It has to be shipped. The things that are inside the product need to be manufactured. Does it really cost $1? Probably not. And so in the story of stuff, she was talking about the radio and how it really, you're not paying for the true cost of that product. So the true cost of that product is the fact that people are paying for it with their health, with their income, their sanity, working at factories like in the beginning of the chapter, the Maquiadora. So that would be there. People are paying for it along the line so that we can get it for a cheaper price. So that's an externality. So this is showing kind of how that would look if you applied those externalities. So you've got supply 1, you've got supply 2, you've got demand. So supply 1, S1, is with that externality factored in. So you can see there's a new equilibrium point. The price has gone up because now you have to factor that in. So somebody has to pay for it, whether it's a consumer or the producer. So that has changed. And so that's definitely, if we want to not have a market failure, we need to incorporate those externalities somewhere. So down here, it talks about GDP, and this once again should be familiar for those, especially in economics. So that's gross domestic product, and that's just measuring the wealth of the country based on how much they consume and produce. And that was another thing that was in that video of Story of Stuff. It talked about how we are a nation of consumers. And so how much we produce or consume is our measure of value. So not the best way to measure value, I don't think. But that's what GDP is. And then up here, in order to improve that global environment, we need to increase GDP. So the country needs to be doing well as far as consuming and producing. And then usually what happens with GDP is it means that the country is developed, and so or on the verge of developed. And so as the GDP increases, the birth rate decreases. And that usually has to do with income, social status, education. Those all factor into decreasing birth rate, increasing GDP. And so as you increase GDP, there's more money for environmental improvements. So countries that are developing, they tend to be really poor on the environmental side because their GDP is low. And so they don't have money to improve. They're trying to survive. So putting in solar panels and driving hybrid cars is really not in the picture. But as they improve and as their income increases, they have room for that. They have room for looking at environmental issues in their country. So that's what that's talking about. And then down here, GPI, that's a measure of the economic status. So kind of like GDP, except for it factors in other things. So it factors in personal consumption, just like before, income distribution. So that's something that GDP didn't. Higher education and resource depletion. So now we're looking at more environmental issues, pollution, health. So GPI is a better measure of the country's status, I think, rather than GDP, because it's not about producing and consuming. It's about other things like environmental integrity as well. All right, so looking at this next page, Kuznets curve, it's up here. And so basically what's showing is GDP increases, environmental degradation also increases. So the environment worsens as a country is developing. So you can see right up here, and then this is pretty much the developed point. So there's a turning point where as GDP continues, environmental degradation is going to decrease and the environment improves. And so that's what Kuznets curve is. And so if we look at this next section, developing countries, they kind of tend to not. So think about like the U.S. So U.S. went through a period of industrialization. Think about cell phones, for example. We had landlines, then we had huge mobile phones, and now we have little tiny cellular phones. So developing countries, they don't necessarily go through those same stages. They don't go through the landline stage and then the, ancient archaic technology of the huge mobile phone. So they are a lot of times going straight to cell phones, straight to solar technology. A lot of times for them, they don't have big solar grids, and so they are kind of set to jump right on board with the renewable resources. And so that's what a technology transfer would result in leapfrogging. So leapfrogging is skipping those developmental stages that maybe the U.S. or a country that developed a long time ago went through. All right, and then looking at the economic health, it depends on three things. So there's three forms of capital for countries. And so there's natural capital. So what is the resources of the planet or the area, the country? The human capital, so human knowledge, abilities, that would be the input or the benefit of the human portion of it. And then the manufactured capital is all the goods and infrastructure that's in place. And so in order to look at environmental science, we look at the natural capital, so the resources that are available to that area. And basically, kind of like I mentioned before, if the externalities are assessed, then the demand would decrease because the price is going to go up. So instead of buying those things at the dollar store, they're not going to be the dollar store, it'd be the $5 store. So it's just, we would have to, or somebody else would have to cover that, like maybe the producer themselves, which would drive the price up again. So either we pay for it as a consumer or the producers pay for it. But somebody needs to pay for the externalities in order to have better healthcare, better, working conditions, or just generally better living styles of people in developing countries, because a lot of developed countries seem to take advantage of that. All right, so the ecological economics, basically looking at economics, except for it's looking at the ecological part of it. So it's studying the environmental impact, which is extremely important. So that's where this class, this section anyways, this chapter differs from econ probably. But valuation is assigning a monetary value to something. So you calculated the monetary value of a tree on campus based on how much CO2 it intakes or uptakes, and then its size and maybe its beauty, for example. So we could have a monetary value on natural resources, maybe natural parks. So how much money are people willing to spend to go see something? That has a value. And it might also have another value because it probably has an ecosystem service. So like, for example, wetlands filter water, but they're also cool to see, especially if people want to go see, like down in Florida, for example, alligators. So there's also a value assigned to that. And then if we want to get rid of something that's negative, we tax. So basically, like for cigarettes, for example, they're not healthy. So we put a tax on it and tax them heavily so that people think twice and use less. And so we can do that for other things too. We can do that for pollution. So taxing people for too much carbon, too much sulfur, too much pollutions into the atmosphere. And so that can curb a negative behavior. So taxing is a great way for the government, not so much for the people, but great way for the government to really curb behaviors they don't want. And then if we look at the current system, so the current system, the inputs, we have large amount of resources being used. We have small ecosystem services being valued. That's kind of the inputs. And then the outputs are a large amount of waste. So it's kind of shown up here in this figure. So there's the less sustainable economy, which is what we just talked about, the current one. So we've got lots of energy going in, lots of resource extraction, lots of waste, very little, more like cradle to grave, that we talked about a couple chapters ago. And then the more sustainable economy, which I will mention in the sticky note in a minute, notice how there's more of a cyclical, it's more recycling, that kind of stuff. So small amount of energy going in, small amount of resource extraction, large ecosystem service, and we are benefiting the ecosystem service because it's going right back in, as you can see right here. And then the outputs are a small amount of waste and lots of waste stream recycling. So just meaning taking it out of this waste stream and recycling it back into something. And so this is much more sustainable. And that's kind of what countries need to go towards, is something along those lines. And that would be more like cradle to cradle. So rather than cradle to grave, as in the top picture there. So looking at the sustainable economic system, which was the bottom system we just looked at, there's greater reliance on the ecosystem service. There's less resource extraction, less waste. The bottom one would be the cradle to cradle, where we are using the resource over and over, maybe in different ways, but using it over and over, versus this one being the cradle to grave example. And that concludes 65.